War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, Kronos. The early July sun sat high above him as he raised the scythe and swung at the barley stalks before him. The blade made a slight swishing sound as it cut through the air and then the stalks. They fell, as they always had, in quiet rows, neat and obedient. He propped the scythe, the tool that had been handed down through 6 generations of his family, against the cart and bent to lift the fallen stalks, placing them inside the bed of the wagon. He looked across the barley field. He had only 4 hectares, but these 4 hectares were his, and his alone. The Andros family had come to the fertile valley at the foot of the Little Carpathian Mountains in the middle of the 18th century from Greece. At that time, the land was unclaimed, and it was there that a small band of his distant relatives began their life in the valley. Over time, the family expanded and the land was divided among its members, distant or otherwise. After more than 170 years, his was the only household that still bore the Andros name within the vast Valdros Valley, or the Valley of Andros, as it had been first christened all those years ago. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and reached for his wooden canteen that hung from a hook on the side of the wagon. He opened the top and took a long pull of the water within before stepping towards his horse. He had named the horse Kronos after the god of time, believing that he would grow to be large, strong, and fast-moving like the stud that had sired him. Instead, Kronos had become none of these things. He was medium in size, slow of foot, and nowhere near as strong as his massive father. The irony of the horse's name had been pointed out to Lukas Andros more times than he could count, but he never minded. When talk turned to horses, the name Kronos filled people's heads with visions of power and speed. Lukas took quiet pleasure in the moment that followed, when they finally saw the medium-sized black horse with white spots standing before them. He patted Kronos on the nose and spoke to him in a low voice. "1 more hour, Kronos, then we go to town for some dinner. You like that?" He poured a bit of water into his hand and held it out, letting the horse drink from his palm. He took another drink, screwed the cap back onto the canteen, hung it on the hook, and grabbed the scythe. He walked forward 10 paces, and Kronos obediently followed. He never had to be prompted or pulled to move forward. He stayed with Lukas at all times while in the field. Again, he swung the scythe, and more stalks of barley fell to the ground. An hour later, he had climbed onto the bench of the wagon. He took a moment to admire the stack of barley in the bed of the wagon and smiled. "Okay, Kronos, into town we go." The nearest town was not in the Valdros Valley, but in an adjacent valley about an hour to the west. The town of Zelenek had grown around an ancient monastery that had been built along an old pilgrimage road connecting the communities of Pressburg in the west and Trenchen in the northeast. Now, the road had become a trade route between the 2 larger towns. Getting there for Lukas, however, was not that simple. There was no proper road that led from the Valdros Valley to Zelenek. Only a path that had been worn into the land over many years by harvester wagons and the hooves of their horses. The ground was rocky and uneven, climbing steeply in parts and nearly impassable during the winter months. But what Kronos lacked in strength and speed, he more than made up for in endurance and agility. The path ultimately led Lukas and Kronos to the crest of a ridge that overlooked the town. From there, he could see the stream break from the rocks of the opposite hill and flow towards the mill it had turned for generations, the same mill that waited now at the base of the slope. He always took a small break here for his horse to rest. You know the deal, Kronos. First we sell the barley, then we get some food. But here, Lukas reached into the wagon, pulled out a stalk of barley, and stretched his arm forward until Kronos could snatch it from his hand with his teeth. 15 minutes later, he jumped down from the bench and walked into the mill, where he saw Anton Faber working the grinding stones, turning grain into flour. The sound of the water wheel outside filled the building with a slow, steady groan. A wooden shaft ran through the floor, carrying the wheel's motion to a pair of great stones that ground together above the pit. Anton stood beside them, guiding the flow of grain from a hopper into the center hole and watching the flour spill out along the edges. Dust hung in the air, sweet and earthy, settling on his sleeves and beard like powder. Like many rural millers, Anton had refused to modernize, even when others along the trade road had switched to the new steel rollers powered by steam or, in some places, electricity. He said the stones had served his father and grandfather well, and they would serve him too, as would the stream. Lukas cleared his throat. Anton looked up. "Lukas, welcome!" Anton was always happy to have company, and Lukas knew that he was one of Anton's favorites these days. Lukas came to the mill almost daily during harvest season. He would fill his wagon, traverse the path, sell his barley to Anton, use part of the crown to his pay to buy dinner or feed, then pocket the rest. His great-grandfather had discovered many years ago that by planting only 2 of their 4 hectares each season and allowing the other 2 to replenish, the land would stay fertile. This practice had yielded plentiful harvests for generations, and over time, the family had amassed a modest fortune. Much of it, however, was lost when Lukas' father placed their savings in the provincial bank of Zelenek. The bank collapsed without warning, taking the money with it. Since then, Lukas had trusted only what he could see: the soil beneath his boots, the grain in his hands, and the steady turn of the stream that powered Anton's mill. He was careful with what he earned, which was why he kept only 1 wagon and 1 horse. "What do we have today?" Anton asked over the din of the grinding mill. Lukas' cart was a small 2-wheeled lad wagon that most called a farm cart. It carried about 300 kilograms of light grain. He could have bought a larger cart and harvested more each day, but that would have meant a larger horse, and that required spending, something Lukas was not prepared to do, even though he easily could. It would also have meant replacing Kronos, and that he would not do, not until his best friend breathed his last. "About the same as yesterday," Lukas replied. "What did I pay you yesterday?" Lukas did not have to think at all for this answer. 80 crowns. "Oh, that's right. Well, let's take a look." The 2 men walked out of the mill and towards the cart. Anton patted Kronos on the nose and surveyed the load. "Looks a little lighter. You good with 70 crowns today?" Anton asked. Lukas knew that Anton had to pay for transport of his flour to places like Vienna and Budapest so it could be sold. He also knew that sometimes Anton had to wait to be paid, and that made him watch the money he had on hand. 70 is fine, Anton," and the 2 men started back for the mill. Anton spoke as he led Lukas inside. "I was excited to hear of the railroads the Archduke wished to build. That would make it much cheaper for me to send flour out." "Wouldn't that be wonderful?" Lukas added excitedly. "Imagine it. Someday soon Franz Ferdinand will take the throne. His plans for infrastructure are phenomenal. Can you imagine a train connecting our valleys? I could retire Kronos, maybe even convince the government to build a station in the Valdros Valley." Anton shook his head. "Too bad that's not going to happen now." Lukas said the next part quietly. He did not want to be labeled as unloyal or even a subversive. Obviously, Franz Joseph has to die first, but he's what, 83? I, for one, am greatly anticipating things getting much better for us when Ferdinand takes the throne." Anton was looking at him curiously now. "You haven't heard, have you, Lucas?" "Heard what?" Lucas asked. "The Archduke is dead." "What?" Lucas was floored by the news. "What do you mean?" "He and his wife were shot last Sunday in Sarajevo." It had been 2 months since Lucas had been told the news. Now he sat alone in his small cabin drinking tea. He had never married, never had children. He was happy this way, but he also knew that if he died today, his family name would only live on through the name of the valley and this farm. Things had escalated quickly in the weeks since the assassination in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia, and then Russia had moved to defend the Serbs. Germany answered by declaring war on Russia, and soon the other nations followed the paths laid out by their alliances. What had begun as a single act in a distant city had become a full-scale conflict, what people were beginning to call the Great War. As he looked out towards the sunset to the west, a cloud of dust appeared in the distance. It appeared to get larger, closer even. He recognized a motor car approaching. This was odd for the area since there was no infrastructure for motor cars over the hills and ridges that surrounded the valley. He rose and walked to the door, turned the handle, and stood on the small porch that overlooked his fields. The motor car approached, taking a path that cut between two of his fields. He sipped his tea as the vehicle came to a stop and a man in a military uniform emerged from the passenger seat, leaving the driver in the vehicle. "What can I do for you?" Lucas asked. "Lukas Andros," the man replied. "Yes, sir, that's me." The official held his hand out. Lucas shook it. "Sergeant Vallow, I'm sorry to intrude on your evening, especially so late, but I've been sent to ask the families within this valley to assist with the war effort. Yours is my last stop." "I see." Lucas paused. "What kind of assistance?" The sergeant turned and looked out at the fields. "Well, obviously the soldiers need to eat, so we're looking for grains. We'll be happy to commandeer your barley, sir." "Commandeer my barley? So you aren't asking, are you?" Lucas was visibly irritated. The sergeant ignored his question and went on. "Also, we were told that you have a horse that's particularly agile, one that's very used to rugged terrain. Is that true?" "This is true. Kronos is very good at rocky terrain, but I'm sorry, I need him to help me with the fields here. He's my only horse." "Your only horse? That's rather odd for a farm, don't you think?" the sergeant asked. "Normally, yes, but he's all I've ever needed," Lucas replied. "Well, I'm sorry, sir. I said we were asking, but we really aren't. We need horses that can pull the injured in carts over rugged terrain, and those horses are getting harder and harder to come by. I'm afraid we'll be taking them. Besides, we'll have men to harvest the grain in this entire valley, so really, you won't need your horse." The air went out of Lucas' chest. This was absurd. "You're going to take my barley and my only horse?" "Not right now," answered the sergeant, "but within 2 weeks." He turned to walk away, then turned back. "I'm sorry," then got back into the car. Lucas watched the car back out and start to drive away. He yelled towards the vehicle that could no longer hear him. "How am I supposed to support myself? This farm?" He kept to his routine for the next 2 weeks before the carts and wagons began to enter the valley. Motor cars still had difficulties since there were no proper roads leading into the valley, and those that tried the journey often found themselves stuck on the stones and ridges that the horse-drawn carts could so easily pass over and around. Sergeant Vallow arrived again at his door on a Tuesday morning, the sun barely cresting the little Carpathian mountains to the east of him. This time he was accompanied by more than just a driver. Lucas met him at the door. "Sergeant Vallow, I see you got wise and brought carts instead of motor cars this time." "Mr. Andros," the sergeant said, removing his cap, Yes, we learned quite a lesson 2 weeks ago. My apologies for the delay. We're here for your horse. It was then that Lucas noticed that the military had amassed a large force in the valley, and with that force, all of the horses. He recognized some of them as belonging to his neighbors. I see it's not just my horse you plan on taking, Lucas mentioned. No, Ballo admitted, glancing over his shoulder at the activity. I'm afraid we need all we can get for the war effort. Those damn Serbs will pay for what they did. The king's been beside himself with grief over this whole affair. I'm sure he is, Lucas added, paused and then continued. Look, I have nothing here. I'm too old to fight. No family here, at least not yet. Allow me to volunteer in whichever capacity allows me to stay with my horse. Volunteers are something that we sorely need, however, I'm just a sergeant. I see. Well, maybe I'll just hitch a ride with you. Maybe I can ride Kronos to wherever you go, and I can ask someone of a higher ranking. That won't be necessary, Mr. Andros. Ballo pointed towards the only covered wagon in the line. You can speak to Colonel Reinslanger yourself. Thank you. I'll do that. He knew that he could not stop what was coming, the losing of his grain and his horse. He also knew that he had enough crowns stored away to allow him to live comfortably for a number of years. He also knew that he could easily buy another horse, but he wanted to be with Kronos. The conversation with the colonel had been brief but effective. Lucas had laid everything on the table. The fact that he had no wife, no children, and no need to cultivate the barley for the army should he stay. The colonel was not only receptive, but impressed that Lucas could adeptly maneuver a wagon through the roughest terrain he personally had never experienced until that morning. You will drive an ambulance then, the colonel had said, taking the wounded to hospitals when you can, and sometimes transporting the dead. That had been 6 months ago. Now, Lucas and Kronos were deeply entrenched in the life only a worldwide conflict could provide. He and Kronos spent 12 hours per day positioned at the entrance to the trench lines waiting for the injured and sometimes the dead to be carried out. The moon hung high in a cloudless sky. As an ambulance driver, Lucas was fortunate to have a tent about a mile from the fighting. When he was not on shift, like tonight, he sat beside a roaring fire with the others. Some were fellow ambulance drivers. Others were men from the supply trains and logistics, all of them essential to the war. Tonight, he sat next to Joseph Karloff, a driver like himself. How many runs today? Karloff asked. I think around 14, 15? Not sure. I lost track. Their camp was a mile from the current fighting, and the medical tents as well as the triage tents were another mile to the west of them. The road to those facilities was in fair condition, so he and Kronos made good time. I only did 7. Why only 7? Lucas asked. Had a lieutenant get injured. Did you know that they send officers to a different medical facility? Found that out today, Karloff added. What do you mean? Lucas was genuinely curious. There's a town about 15 miles south of here over that small mountain range. Karloff pointed in that direction. It was dark, but Lucas' eyes followed. It's called Velenak. We occupied it a few months ago. I imagine there's still snow on that range, Lucas asked. Yeah, quite a bit, and the terrain is really rough. Kronos could probably handle that pretty well, Lucas said. He's used to that in the winter. Kronos had been skittish when he was first unloaded from the transport train that had brought them to Serbia. The train had stopped too close to the battle lines for Lucas's liking. The shelling and gunfire had rattled the air, and of course, a horse would be frightened by it. Thankfully, Lucas had been able to calm the beast down and ride him the mile or so in which they would be stationed. It's been a long day, Karloff. I'm going to go lay down, maybe read a book. Sounds good. I'll be following you real soon, I'm sure. Lucas stood and looked across the firelight to see Kronos, tied to a tree and feeding on the vegetation underfoot. His horse would sleep soon as well, and they would do it all over again tomorrow. He was awoken by a shake on his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open. Before him was a fresh-faced boy who could not be more than 17 years old. "Mr. Andros, sir, you're needed immediately." He rubbed his eyes and looked past the young man towards the door of his tent. It was still quite dark outside. "What time is it?" he asked. "It's about 1 a.m., sir." "I'm not on shift for another 5 hours." Lukas started to lie back down on his cot. "Sir, it's General Varga. He's gravely injured. I was asked to bring you back right away." General Victor Varga was the commanding officer for their section. Lukas knew this. He also knew now that this meant a long, treacherous trip through snow and ice. He sat up again, put his legs on the floor, and started to dress. "Well, I guess duty over sleep." "Thank you, sir," the boy responded. "I'll wait for you outside." Kronos had no saddle. This was normal. Lukas preferred to ride bareback. Outside, the cold bit at his face as he approached his horse. The young soldier was already mounted, his breath showing in the air. He turned his horse towards the line of lanterns flickering in the distance. The boy led Lukas to a waiting cart where General Varga had already been loaded. No sooner had Lukas swung off of Kronos than a pair of soldiers hurried over to fit the harness and fasten the wagon's traces. "Mr. Andros." The voice was familiar to Lukas. "Valo, is that you?" Valo, the man who had commandeered his barley and his horse, stood before him. It was cold, but he was visibly sweating. The two men shook hands. "I didn't know you were out here," Lukas said. "Just got here a few weeks back. I knew you were here, just hadn't run into you." "What happened?" Lukas asked. "Son of a bitch looked over the parapet too far and for too long. Sniper got him. We patched him up pretty good, but he needs to get to Velenak as soon as we can." "Why wait for me then?" "Because I had confidence that, when in a hurry, your horse can handle the terrain." Valo brushed Kronos aside as he spoke. "As can you." "I'm sure we can." "Take this." He passed him a field lantern painted black on every side but one, where a thin opening allowed a small wedge of light to fall ahead of the wagon. It was meant to guide the driver without drawing the eye of anyone watching from the dark. Taking the lantern, he placed it on the bench of the cart and then hopped up himself. "Am I going alone?" he asked Valo. "I'm afraid so. Just follow this road due south and you'll hit the town in about a half hour." He paused. "Hopefully." Lukas lifted the reins and prepared to move. "Wait." It was Valo again. "Take this too." It took Lukas a moment to recognize the object that Valo was handing him. It was a pistol. Karloff had been right. The path was fogged over and treacherous, steep in places with loose stones and large boulders that made navigation difficult, especially in the dark and with a blacked-out lantern. But true to form, Kronos navigated his way around every obstacle, and they seemed to be making good time. It had been only 15 minutes since they'd left the line, and already they had crested the ridge and begun the descent towards the town. In the distance, Lukas could see the faint, wavering glow of Velenak's lights. Suddenly, in his small beam of light, he could see something in the road just ahead. This was not a rock. It was a man. He slowed Kronos, and eventually they came to a stop. In horror, Lukas noticed the man holding a rifle, and it was pointed straight at him. "I need you to move. I have a badly injured man here who needs to get to the hospital," Lukas yelled. The man stayed silent. He motioned with his rifle for Lukas to get out of the wagon. Lukas complied, but not before dropping the pistol into the back of the wagon. As his feet hit the dirt in the road, he noticed a second man. One he had not seen yet, standing on the side of the road. Another rifle trained on him. Then, footsteps from behind the wagon, where another man stepped out from the darkness, another rifle. Lukas took a deep breath and raised his hands. These men did not speak. They were most likely Serbian and did not even speak his language. Besides, they were commanding the scene just fine without saying a word. The man in front of him motioned up and down with the rifle. Lukas figured he was to get on his knees, but he refused. The men did nothing. He then watched helplessly as the first man, the man that had been in the road, climbed onto the bench of the wagon. He wanted to protest, but he knew it would be futile. All he could do was watch as the man started to drive the cart away into the foggy night. The moonlight illuminated the fog just enough to where Lukas could see the two men, now on either side of him, still pointing their rifles. He knew the end was near. At that moment, the ground shook. A bright light lit up the sky. A gust of hot wind blew Lukas over to his left just as the rifles cracked. The night sky darkened as quickly as it had brightened. Must have been a shell, but fired from where? He realized that it didn't matter. That shell just saved his life. Checking his body for wounds, he found none as he got to his feet. Both men were on the ground now, both bleeding, their rifles laying beside them with smoke wisping out the barrel. "They shot each other?" he said under his breath. Then he heard hooves hitting and wheels turning against the frozen dirt on the road. He looked in that direction, into the fog. The first man must have heard the blast and turned around to investigate. He picked up one of the deceased men's rifles and trained it in the direction of the noise. From the fog, he watched as Kronos emerged, still pulling the wagon. The man on the bench was slumped over, not moving. Lukas lowered the rifle as Kronos got closer and then stopped just before him. "What? How?" he asked no one in particular. He walked to Kronos and pouted his snout. "What happened here, boy?" He knew he would get no answer, but he asked anyhow. Climbing up onto the bench, he pushed the body off of the wagon. It fell onto the ground with a thud next to one of his would-be killers. He picked the lantern off the hook and trained it behind him to the bed of the wagon itself. The general's hands were laying on his chest, and in one hand was the pistol. In a quiet and gravelly voice, the general said, "Let's go." You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.